While Rio de Janeiro prepares for another day of chaotic routine, a family is about to discover that their son can disappear in broad daylight without the city even noticing. The sun was already punishing the narrow alleyways of the community when Maria Santos woke her youngest son. Miguel was 8 years old, with calloused bare feet, knees marked by games played on uneven concrete, and that serious look that poor children develop too early. It was Thursday, the day to fetch water from the spout at the top of the hill because the supply had been cut off for 3 days. Maria handed 2 empty jugs into the boy's small hands and asked him to be quick before the sun got too hot. Miguel nodded, took the jugs, and walked out the door, barefoot as always, wearing only faded shorts and a t-shirt with holes in the back. He passed the wooden bench, painted teal green, that sat at the entrance of the alley, the same bench where neighbors sat to talk in the late afternoon, where children rested between games. Miguel had no idea that bench would become his memorial. He continued up the hill, greeting acquaintances, dodging stray dogs, jumping over puddles of open sewage. The community bustled with the morning routine, women hanging laundry, men leaving for informal work, children running aimlessly. Miguel was just one more in the landscape, invisible like so many other poor boys who inhabit the margins of the marvelous city. That same morning, as happened frequently, a middle-aged man was circulating through the community, distributing basic food baskets. Residents knew him as So Beto, Mr. Beto, the benefactor who had helped needy families for years. He arrived in a worn-out white VW Combi, always smiling, always generous, always interested in the children's stories. "Does this boy need shoes?" he would ask mothers. "Is this girl in school yet?" His presence was so common that no one truly paid attention. That morning, while Miguel climbed the hill with his empty jugs, the white Combi was parked near the large intersection that led to the water spout. No one made the connection. No one saw anything wrong. After all, Seu Beto was always there. But Miguel never reached the spout. No one knows exactly at what moment he vanished from the path he took every day. There was no scream, no struggle, no witness willing to speak. When Maria realized it was noon and her son hadn't returned, her heart tightened. She ran up the hill, screaming his name, asking everyone, overturning every alley. Neighbors helped in the initial search, but hours passed and Miguel remained missing, as if he had been swallowed by the very city that ignored him. In the early evening, Maria finally managed to register the disappearance at the police station. The service was cold, procedural, mechanical. The officer on duty barely looked at the blurry photo Maria had brought, suggesting the boy had probably run away from home, or gotten involved with drug trafficking, or simply decided to live on the streets. "You know how it is, right? A boy that age already has a mind of his own," the officer said without looking up from the paper. Maria tried to explain that Miguel was obedient, that he wouldn't run away, that something had happened, but her trembling voice of a poor mother held no weight in that environment. The report was filed, but no patrol car went out to search. No operation was mounted. No resources were mobilized. In the following days, the family improvised their own search. Miguel's father, José, a man of few words and many of life's scars, scoured hospitals, morgues, shelters, and even drug dens, asking if anyone had seen the boy. The older sister, Fernanda, only 15 years old, began pasting handmade posters on utility poles, with Miguel's photo and a public phone number from the community. Articulate and determined, she was not. Afraid to face security guards or wealthy residents who looked at her with suspicion, a skill that would later prove crucial. Maria turned the teal-green bench into a small altar, placing a candle, flowers picked from the brush, and her son's photo protected by plastic. She sat there every afternoon, as if waiting for Miguel to return with the water jugs he never filled. The community, however, gradually lost interest. Disappearances were common, tragedies were part of daily life, and life had to go on. Some neighbors began whispering theories, that Miguel had been recruited by gangs, that he had been taken by a madman, that he had drowned in a ditch. Others simply stopped asking, avoiding Maria's desperate gaze. The city continued its frantic routine, and Miguel became just another number in a statistic no one wanted to face. To Rio society, boys like Miguel were born and disappeared. without anyone caring. They were the invisible ones, the disposable ones, those who occupied the uncomfortable space between extreme poverty and generalized indifference. Miguel's blurry photo, stamped on the poster with the word "missing" in red, was just one among hundreds covering the poles of the periphery. No one stopped to look. No one called the number. No one wondered where that 8-year-old boy was, with the serious look and bare feet, who one day went out to get water and never came back. Maria remained seated on the bench until nightfall, staring fixatedly at the colorful favela. Stretching down the slope, houses stacked in shades of green, blue, and yellow, as if the chaotic beauty of the landscape could somehow return her son. The narration closes with a painful reflection. Someone saw Miguel that day. Someone knows what happened. But in a city that learned not to see its most vulnerable children, silence is easier than the truth, and when society collectively chooses to close its eyes, even the most brutal crime can happen in broad daylight. Stay until the end to discover how a case ignored by everyone transforms, years later, into an example of delayed but relentless justice. You will understand how a simple forgotten photo can change everything. 3 months later, the inquiry is officially archived due to lack of evidence. But while the police close the case, a mother transforms her pain into resistance, and a young intern sees in that injustice a reason to dedicate his life to investigation. Autumn arrived in Rio, bringing cloudy days and the confirmation of what Maria feared most. Miguel's case would be archived. The police station justified the decision with bureaucratic arguments: absence of concrete leads, lack of reliable witnesses, impossibility of allocating resources for a prolonged search without signs of a crime. The police report, which was already shallow and superficial, was stored in a cardboard box, along with dozens of other unsolved cases. To the system, Miguel officially ceased to exist. He was just another poor boy who vanished, and the state had neither the time nor the will to look for him. Maria received the news sitting on the teal-green bench that had become her second home. She didn't cry at that moment. She just pressed the laminated photo of her son against her chest and made a silent promise. As long as she had life, she would not let the world forget Miguel. In the following months, that bench turned into an increasingly elaborate memorial. Maria started bringing fresh flowers every week, lighting candles that resisted the night wind, pasting newspaper clippings about missing children, creating a kind of mural of pain. The bench became a reference point in the community, a physical reminder that Miguel existed, that he mattered, even if only to his family. José, the father, adopted a different strategy. A man of action and little speech, he began to traverse Rio de Janeiro in an obsessive and solitary search. He woke up before the sun and spent the entire day visiting unlikely places: shelters for the homeless, psychiatric hospitals, rehab centers, clandestine shelters. He always carried the same crumpled photo of Miguel, showing it to doormen, security guards, social workers, anyone willing to look. José took on small night jobs to pay for bus and subway fares, sacrificing sleep and health in the name of an increasingly unlikely hope. In his desperate loneliness, he was even approached by intermediaries of organized crime offering help in exchange for favors, but something inside him, even though shattered, recoiled. The last thing he would do was betray his son's memory by getting involved with those who made other children disappear. Fernanda, Miguel's teenage sister, found her own way to fight. With the reckless courage of youth and an uncommon capacity for articulation, she began leaving the community to paste posters in wealthy neighborhoods of the South Zone: Ipanema, Leblon, Copacabana, places where people had resources, contacts, where perhaps someone could help. She pasted posters on poles, condominium gates, bus stops, always running the risk of being expelled or humiliated. Many times she was approached by security guards who treated her as a suspect, by residents complaining about visual pollution, by shopkeepers who tore down the posters as soon as she turned her back. But Fernanda persisted, returning every week, pasting new posters over the old ones, as if every piece of paper could pierce the bubble of indifference separating the Rio of the rich from the Rio of the poor. Her determination drew attention. She didn't lower her head. She looked people in the eye. She spoke with conviction. It was a seed being planted for the future. It was during one of these filing routines that a young intern from the civil police had his first contact with the case. Rafael Oliveira was 22 years old, had just joined the force, and was assigned to organize old inquiries at the station. Among piles of dusty folders, he found Miguel Santos's dossier. Upon opening it, he was shocked by the poverty of information. Only 4 pages, 2 superficial statements, no photos of the scene, no real investigative effort. The final report read only, "Archived due to absence of evidence and signs of crime, possible voluntary runaway, or involvement with criminal elements." Rafael read and reread those pages, feeling a growing discomfort in his chest. He came from a simple family, knew the reality of the peripheries, knew that boys like Miguel were systematically neglected by the state. That case wasn't an investigation that failed. It was an investigation that never truly began. When he showed the dossier to an older police officer, the response was cynical. "Forget it, kid. Slum kids who disappear. It's just like that. No body, no crime, nothing we can do. Learn quickly not to take work home." But Rafael couldn't not take it home. Something in the coldness of that process, in the institutionalized indifference, in the bureaucratic cruelty, revolted him deeply. Driven by a restlessness he couldn't explain, Rafael made a copy of the file and kept it in a special folder he would keep for the next 10 years. A folder labeled "Cases That Keep Me Awake," where he would archive all the injustices he witnessed throughout his career, feeding a silent determination to one day make a difference. He didn't yet know what he would do with it, but something inside him refused to accept that Miguel's story would end that way. In the following months, Rafael discreetly returned to the case whenever he had free time. He visited the community where Miguel lived, spoke briefly with Maria at the bench memorial, made notes in a personal notebook. It wasn't an official investigation. He didn't have authorization or resources for that. But it was his way of saying that boy mattered, that his life was worth more than 4 pages in a forgotten file. The silent encounter between Maria's pain and Rafael's indignation planted a seed that would take years to germinate, but would eventually grow into something bigger than both could imagine at that moment. Meanwhile, life in the community followed its cruel course. Miguel's case was replaced by other tragedies, new disappearances, new deaths, new griefs. People stopped asking about him, the posters faded under the sun and rain, and even some neighbors began suggesting that Maria needed to accept it and move on. But she didn't move on. Every afternoon, religiously, she sat on the teal-green bench, looking at the colorful favela stretching down the hill, waiting to see that small silhouette with bare feet coming up the alley with 2 water jugs in hand. Hope, however irrational, remained alive. And so did the pain. Continue watching to see how this obsession will transform into something bigger. Because even when the system gives up, there are people who refuse to forget. 3 years pass. The flowers on the bench dry up, the family falls apart, and everything indicates that Miguel will never be found, neither alive nor dead. This is the darkest point of the story, where even the most stubborn hope begins to die. 3 years without news, 3 years of fruitless searches, 3 years of hope being slowly massacred by reality. The Santos family was destroyed, not just emotionally but in every possible dimension of human existence. Maria developed a deep depression that prevented her from working. She spent entire days sitting on the teal-green bench, talking alone to her son's photo, asking where he was, apologizing for letting him go out alone that morning. Neighbors began whispering that she was going crazy, and perhaps she was. Guilt and absence are potent fuels for mental disintegration. Jose, in turn, was physically exhausted and financially ruined. The constant searches kept him from steady jobs, and he survived on increasingly precarious and exhausting gigs. Desperate for money to keep looking for his son, he came dangerously close to accepting jobs offered by elements linked to crime, but at the last moment always pulled back. Miguel's image stopped him from crossing that line. Still, the Temptation was constant, and the weight of resisting it increased his exhaustion. His health visibly deteriorated, prematurely graying hair, constant back pain, a persistent cough he refused to treat. He was dying slowly, consumed by the impossible search. Fernanda, now 18, carried the weight, of being the only functional person in the family. She had dropped out of school to work as a maid, in houses in the South Zone, supporting parents who could no longer work. On weekends, she still pasted some posters, but the frequency had dropped drastically. She was exhausted, physically and emotionally. Often she cried alone on the bus returning home, feeling she was betraying her brother by giving up the search, but at the same time knowing someone needed to keep the family standing. The internal conflict consumed her silently. The teal-green bench, which was once a vibrant memorial, began to show signs of abandonment. Fresh flowers gave way to faded artificial ones, then just dry flowers, then nothing. Miguel's photo, once carefully protected by plastic, was yellowed and torn at the edges. Dry leaves and dust accumulated on the seat. In a particularly painful episode, Fernanda saw a group of teenagers tear down one of Miguel's last posters from a pole, laughing and using the paper to roll some substance. She wanted to scream, wanted to run after them, but simply didn't have the energy left. She stood still, silent tears streaming down her face, understanding that the community had moved on. Miguel was the past, a ghost. No one cared anymore. Rafael, now a graduated police officer of 25, returned to the case a few times during those 3 years, but always hit insurmountable walls. He tried to officially reopen the investigation, but his superiors denied it due to lack of legal justification. He tried to track possible witnesses, but found only confused and contradictory memories. After all, it had been over 1,000 days since the disappearance. He tried to search for unidentified bodies in morgues in different cities, but the volume was frightening and the resources non-existent. Bureaucracy, lack of institutional support, and the cruel reality of peripheral Brazil conspired against any possibility of progress. During a particularly difficult visit to the community, Rafael found Maria on the bench, thinner and paler than ever. She recognized him immediately. He was the only police officer who returned, the only one who seemed to truly care. "He's dead, isn't he?" she asked with a voice so weak Rafael had to lean in to hear. "You can't think like that," he tried to reply, but the words sounded hollow even to him. Maria just shook her head slowly. 3 years, she said. "If my boy were alive, someone would have seen him. The city swallowed my son, and no one cares because he was poor, black, invisible." Rafael couldn't disagree. He knew she was right. Boys like Miguel disappeared every day in Rio de Janeiro, and the state treated every case with the same bureaucratic indifference. There was no body, so there was no crime. There was no crime, so there was no investigation. There was no investigation, so there was no justice. The vicious cycle of inequality turned children into ghosts while still alive. And society continued its routine without losing a night of sleep. At this moment, and the narration needs to state this with absolute clarity, no one believes Miguel will be found, neither alive nor dead. This is the absolute bottom of the well. Rafael went home that day, feeling something dangerously close to despair. He had joined the police wanting to make a difference, but the system seemed designed specifically to prevent justice from being done for the most vulnerable. The nights of that period were the hardest for everyone involved. Maria had recurring nightmares where she saw Miguel, calling for her from dark places she couldn't reach. José developed chronic insomnia, spending nights awake mentally replaying every place he visited, every face he saw, every possibility he investigated. Fernanda cried silently in the bathroom so her parents wouldn't hear, feeling she was losing. Not only her brother, but also her own youth, sacrificed on the altar of a tragedy without resolution. The city of Rio de Janeiro, meanwhile, continued its dual existence. On one side, tourist beaches, luxury condos, expensive restaurants. On the other, overcrowded favelas, precarious sanitation, barefoot boys running through narrow alleys. Miguel was just one more who fell into the crack between these two worlds, an uncomfortable reminder that inequality isn't just economic. It also determines who deserves to be looked for and who can disappear without consequences. This was the lowest point of the story, the moment when even the most persistent began to accept that perhaps there would be no happy ending, that perhaps some stories simply ended without conclusion, leaving only pain and unanswered questions. But the story doesn't end here, because sometimes, when everything seems absolutely lost, a forgotten detail resurfaces from the past and changes everything. Stay for the next block and discover what no one expected. 2012. 10 years after the disappearance, an old photograph taken by chance in another context falls into the investigator's hands, and a detail impossible to ignore brings Miguel back from the dead. Rafael Oliveira was now 32 years old and had become a respected investigator in crimes against children and adolescents. The obsession that began with Miguel's case had shaped his entire career, and he developed expertise in child disappearances, exploitation of minors, and child trafficking. On a rainy afternoon in July, he was receiving dossiers from an international NGO that had spent years documenting the vulnerability of children in major Brazilian cities. The material was arriving now as part of a new agreement between the organization and the civil police, a belated effort to cross-reference historical images with cases of missing children who had never been adequately investigated. It was extensive anthropological and photographic work, with hundreds of images of street children between 2000 and 2005. Rafael leafed through the photos mechanically, studying every face, every background, looking for clues for active cases. There were images from São Paulo, Salvador, Recife, Belém, and then, on page 2147, a photo from Rio de Janeiro, dated August 2003. The image showed a boy sitting on a beaten earth floor, arms crossed over his knees in a defensive posture, serious gaze fixed on the camera. The hair was longer and disheveled, the face a bit thinner, but there was something in those eyes that made Rafael stop breathing for a second. He knew that look. He knew that posture. He knew the way the fingers interlaced nervously, the faint scar near the left eyebrow. With hands shaking slightly, Rafael stood up from his chair and walked to the personal file he kept locked in a drawer, that folder labeled Cases That Keep Me Awake, guarded religiously for 10 years, full of copies of the Miguel Santos case. He placed the faded photo of the 8-year-old boy next to the NGO's image. The similarities were disturbing. The shape of the ear, the distance between the eyes, the position of the two front teeth slightly separated, the scar on the eyebrow. It could be a coincidence. It could just be two similar boys. But Rafael felt in his gut that it wasn't. That was Miguel 1 year after the disappearance, alive and photographed somewhere in Rio de Janeiro. For a long moment, Rafael simply stood looking at the two images side by side, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Relief for a potential lead after so long, anger that this photo had existed for nearly a decade without anyone connecting it to the missing boy, and profound sadness realizing that Miguel had been alive, somewhere in the same city, while his family searched desperately. The photo existed, the tools to find him existed. But the system didn't see children like Miguel, and this institutionalized invisibility cost precious years, perhaps the boy's very life. The investigator spent the next few weeks in a feverish state of research. He located the NGO photographer, a Dane named Henrik, who had spent 6 months in Brazil documenting vulnerable childhood. Henrik vaguely remembered that photo. It had been taken near a large intersection in Rio's West Zone, where several children begged and sold candy at traffic lights. He didn't know the boy's name, hadn't stayed long enough to talk. There were so many like him, Henrik explained with regret. Children the city forgot. I took hundreds of photos trying to show the world they existed, but I think the world preferred not to look. Rafael cross-referenced the location with maps from 2003, identifying high-traffic areas in the West Zone where groups of children were frequently seen working at signals. He went back to the police station archives and found old reports on child exploitation schemes, adults who recruited boys and girls in favelas, promising shelter and food, but actually using them for forced begging and informal labor. There were scattered complaints, never thoroughly investigated, of a man known as Seu Beto, who presented himself in communities as a social benefactor, distributing food baskets and clothes, but who actually selected vulnerable children, especially those without constant supervision. The name lit a light in Rafael's memory. He remembered the white combi, the food baskets, that man's constant presence in the community during the period of Miguel's disappearance. With this new line of investigation, Rafael returned to the community where Miguel had disappeared. He sought out old residents, people who were there in 2002. Many didn't remember, others were afraid to speak, but eventually a former community leader confirmed, off the record, that Seu Beto indeed frequented the area at that time. He was smart, she said. He didn't take children from structured families. He chose boys from very poor homes or who spent a lot of time alone, children whose absence no one would notice immediately. The profile fit Miguel perfectly. Alone on the morning of the disappearance, from a poor family without resources to make noise, in an area where his absence could easily be confused with running away or an accident. The emotional turning point happened when Rafael, armed with the high-quality printed photo, went to the teal-green bench where Maria still went occasionally. She was older, hair almost completely white in her early 40s, body bent by the weight of a decade of grief. When Rafael approached and excused himself, she looked at him with that mix of hope and exhaustion that people in prolonged mourning develop. He sat beside her, took a deep breath, and extended the photo without saying anything. Maria took the image with trembling hands. For long seconds, she said absolutely nothing, just stared fixedly at that boy sitting on the ground, at that posture she knew so well, into those eyes that had looked at her thousands of times. Her hands began to shake more intensely, fingers caressing the paper as if they could feel the texture of her son's skin through the photograph. A solitary tear fell onto the image, slightly blurring the ink. Then finally, her voice came out in a hoarse, broken whisper. "It's him." She brought her free hand to the boy's face in the photo, delicately touching the scar on the eyebrow. "Look at this here," she said with a choked voice pointing for Rafael. "From the time he fell running after a kite, 3 stitches here at the clinic. He cried so much but stayed quiet while the nurse sewed it up." Her tears were now falling freely. "And look how he crosses his arms. He always did that when he was nervous or scared. It's my boy, my boy." She turned to Rafael, holding the photo against her chest. "When was this? When did they take this photo?" Rafael explained gently. "August 2003, approximately 1 year after the disappearance." Maria broke down completely, not out of pure despair like before, but from a complex and devastating emotion. Relief knowing her son had survived at least some time, deep anger that no one had looked properly, piercing pain imagining the suffering he must have gone through, and a renewed and corrosive guilt for not being able to find him when he was still alive, when there was still time. "He was here," she repeated between sobs, "in the same city, and no one saw. No one looked properly. No one cared. My son was alive, and the whole world walked past him without seeing." Don't hang up. In the next block, you will see how the investigator uses this photo to retrace Miguel's steps and expose an exploitation network that operated for years protected by social indifference. With the photo as a starting point, Rafael dives deep into the investigation and discovers that Miguel was not an isolated case. He was just another cog in a brutal child exploitation scheme that the entire city ignored. The official reopening of the Miguel Santos case in 2012 caused a minor ripple in local media. 10 years was too long to generate public commotion, and the story of yet another missing poor boy didn't sell newspapers like other more spectacular crimes. But Rafael didn't care about press attention. He had a personal mission now. With the photo as evidence that Miguel was alive after the disappearance, he secured a judicial authorization for a full investigation, arguing there was concrete indication of a continuing crime and a possible exploitation network. The judge, moved by the investigators' persistence and the glaring failure of the original investigation, granted access to shelter archives, transport records, old security cameras, the few that existed, and most importantly, permission to interrogate persons of interest. The main focus of the first phase was to establish the existence of an organized network. Rafael began by revisiting old archived complaints about Seu Beto, Roberto Silva Santos, 58 years old, a resident of the West Zone, with no criminal record and a public reputation as a community helper. The man had supposedly donated food, baskets and clothes to favelas for decades, maintaining an image of a benefactor that guaranteed him access and trust. But when Rafael began digging deeper, cracks appeared in this virtuous facade. The second phase of the investigation brought disturbing discoveries. Rafael found fragmented reports from at least 7 different families spread across various communities in Rio who had lost children in similar circumstances between 2000 and 2005. Children aged 7 to 12, usually boys, always from very poor families, always in moments of vulnerability. A pattern began to emerge, and Rafael meticulously assembled a timeline. Seu Beto visited communities under the pretext of charity, identified children in precarious situations, gained the family's trust. Then, subtly, he offered opportunities for the boys. Light work in exchange for food and shelter, promises of education, chances to improve their lives. To desperate families, that sounded like a divine blessing. The third phase brought the missing piece, a witness willing to talk. Rafael located a former volunteer of Seu Beto's alleged shelter, a woman named Clarice who had carried guilt for years and who finally, protected by identity secrecy and moved by the news of the case reopening, agreed to testify. Her revelations were devastating. "He chose smart, obedient boys who wouldn't cause trouble," she recounted with a choked voice. "Boys who already knew the hardness of life and would accept the conditions because they were still better than starving. They stayed in an adapted warehouse, slept on mattresses on the floor, woke up early and were taken to different points in the city, busy intersections, where they spent the whole day begging, selling candy, doing small jobs. They came back at night, handed over all the money, ate little and slept exhausted. Anyone who complained didn't eat. Anyone who tried to run away was threatened with being handed over to worse people." Clarice paused for a long time, breathing with difficulty before continuing. "Miguel arrived scared, asking for his mother. Beto said his mother had authorized it, that it was just temporary, that he would go home soon. The boy believed it because he wanted to believe. After a week, he was already at a traffic light, with a box of candy in his hand, a lost look in his eyes. I saw that and pretended. Everything was fine. I needed the money. I had my own children to feed. I hate myself every day for it." The fourth phase involved locating other surviving victims of the scheme. Rafael identified a young man named Carlos, now 24, who had passed through Seu Beto's shelter between 2003 and 2004. In a preliminary interview, Carlos vaguely mentioned knowing a boy named Miguel, but only when Rafael showed the photo did the memory crystallize. "Him! This one I remember well. He was one of the youngest, always quiet, always sad. Said he wanted to go home, that his mother must be worried. The other. Boys tried to comfort him, but everyone there was broken inside. I remember that at the end of 2004, beginning of 2005, he started getting sick, coughed a lot, had a fever, could barely stand at the traffic light. And Beto didn't take him to the doctor, said it was fussiness that it would pass. One day Miguel simply disappeared. Beto said he had sent him away back home. But we knew it wasn't true. A sick boy like that doesn't go home alone." Carlos's testimony was emotionally devastating for Rafael, and especially for the Santos family, who listened to the recording in a room at the police station. Maria listened in silence, tears flowing uninterruptedly, imagining her son scared, manipulated, working exhausted while she turned the city upside down looking for him, not knowing he was a few kilometers away, visible but invisible, trapped in a situation of exploitation that thousands of Drivers witnessed daily without really seeing. José, the father, had to leave the room in the middle of the testimony, unable to process the information that his son had called for them, had hoped to return home, had trusted lies because he was just a child. Fernanda held her mother's hand, her own, determination transforming into crystalline rage. She knew at that moment what she would do with the rest of her life. With the testimonies consolidated and the pattern established, Rafael secured an arrest warrant for Silberto. The arrest happened in May 2012, during a community event where the man was distributing food, surrounded by people who saw him as a savior. The scene was surreal. While Silberto was handcuffed, neighbors protested indignantly, saying there was a mistake, that he couldn't have done anything wrong. The cognitive dissonance was powerful. How could that kind gentleman, who always helped, be a monster? It was easier to doubt the accusation than to confront the reality that evil often disguises itself as kindness, that predators hide behind carefully constructed social masks. The fifth and most painful phase of the investigation was answering the question that haunted everyone. Where was Miguel now? Clarice had said he stayed in the scheme between 2002 and approximately 2004, 2005, and then vanished when he got sick. Rafael, with judicial authorization and expanded resources, initiated a systematic search for death records of unidentified boys between passage 2004 and 2005, expanding the search to municipalities neighboring Rio. It was arduous and emotionally exhausting work, cross-referencing physical descriptions, estimated ages, circumstances of death. It took 3 months of tireless research, but Rafael finally found it. A record in a public hospital in Duque de Caxias, a municipality in the Baixada Fluminense, of a boy approximately 11 years old, who died in March 2005 from complications of untreated bacterial pneumonia. The body had been buried as an indigent, John Doe, without identification in a public cemetery. The medical report described a malnourished patient with signs of repetitive work on his hands, arriving at the hospital in critical condition and passing away hours later. No one claimed the body. No one asked who he was. Another invisible child the city left to die alone. Rafael requested exhumation, a delicate process that required careful preparation of the family. When the DNA analysis results arrived, compared with genetic material collected from Maria and José, they confirmed with 99.7% certainty it was Miguel Santos. The boy had survived almost 3 years in exploitation, his small and malnourished body finally succumbing to a disease that would be easily treatable with basic antibiotics and hospital care. He died alone, nameless, familyless, at 11 years old, treated like disposable trash by a system that had failed him since his first day of life. The official notification to the family happened on a rainy afternoon in August, exactly 10 years and 2 months after the disappearance. Rafael was present, as well as a social worker and a psychologist. Maria received the confirmation in silence, as if a part of her had always known. After a long moment, she simply said, "At least now, I can bury my son properly, with his name, with the dignity he always deserved." Miguel's body was exhumed and transferred to Rio de Janeiro. A dignified funeral was held, attended by dozens of people from the community, human rights activists, and even some police officers who had been touched by the case. The small coffin was covered with flowers and photos of Miguel at different ages. Maria placed inside the plastic water jugs, the same ones her son was supposed to fill that morning in 2002, as a symbol of what was stolen from him, the chance to simply be a child. Fernanda spoke at the funeral, her voice steady despite the tears. "My brother didn't die just because a bad man exploited him. He died because an entire society chose not to see, because poverty makes children invisible, because the system systematically fails those who need it most." She looked at the people present and continued, "But Miguel's story won't end here. We will transform this pain into action. No other family will wait 10 years for answers. No other child will die invisible." In the interrogations that followed the arrest, Silberto maintained a mask of innocence for hours, claiming he only helped children, that he never forced anyone to do anything. But when confronted with specific photos, including Miguel's, and with reports from multiple witnesses, the facade began to crack. He admitted to having taken in several children over the years, but denied exploitation, saying it was light work in exchange for a roof and food. He showed no remorse, only irritation at being caught. To him, those children were resources, not people, and the society that ignored them daily at the traffic lights was a silent accomplice to his operation. The investigation revealed that at least 6 other children had passed through Subeto's scheme over 15 years. Some managed to escape eventually, others were returned when they got older and less profitable, but there were cases where the whereabouts remained unknown. Rafael opened parallel investigations for each one, determined to give closure to more families. The case went to trial in February 2013. The preparation was meticulous, with Rafael and the public prosecutor building an irrefutable dossier of evidence. Testimonies from surviving victims, financial records showing profit from the children's work, photos documenting the exploitation, forensic expertise confirming Miguel's death, and principally Clarice's devastating testimony about the internal workings of the scheme. Everything was aligned so that justice, even if late, would finally be served. In the final block, you will discover how the trial exposed not just a criminal but an entire system that failed, and how a family transformed personal tragedy into a national movement for justice. The trial of Subeto exposes not just a criminal, but an entire system that allowed invisible children to be exploited and forgotten, and from the deepest grief, a movement is born bearing the name of a boy society didn't want to see. The trial of Roberto Silva Santos began in November 2013 in a courtroom packed with journalists, human rights activists, and mainly families of other missing children who saw a reflection of their own tragedies in that case. Maria, Jose, and Fernanda sat in the front row, wearing white t-shirts with Miguel's blurry photo printed on the front, accompanied by the phrase that would become the symbol of a movement: "I existed, but you didn't see me." It was a declaration of pain, but also a collective accusation, because Miguel wasn't just a victim of Subeto, he was a victim of an entire society that chose indifference. During 3 intense weeks, the court heard devastating testimonies that exposed layers of cruelty and negligence. Former victims of the scheme, now young adults, told of years of exploitation, hunger, fear, and abandonment. They described how they were forced to work from 6 in the morning until 10 at night at traffic lights, how they were physically punished if they didn't bring enough money, how they were kept in a state of psychological dependency through constant manipulation and veiled threats that out there was worse, that their families didn't want them anymore. Carlos, the young man who had known Miguel at the shelter, gave one of the most impactful testimonies. With a choked voice, he described seeing Miguel for the last time in January 2005. He was very sick, coughing up blood, had a very high fever, could barely stand. But Beto didn't take him to the doctor, said it was fussiness, that he had to work anyway. A few days later, Miguel wasn't there anymore. Beto said he had sent him back home, but everyone knew he wouldn't send anyone. However, we were profit to him. We knew something terrible had happened, but we were too afraid to ask. Clarice, the former volunteer who provided crucial information, also testified, weeping copiously while asking forgiveness from the families present. She admitted to suspecting something deeply wrong was happening, but remaining silent out of fear. Financial necessity and the human capacity to rationalize the unacceptable when confronting it would require personal sacrifice. I looked at those boys and tried to convince myself they were better off there than on the streets, that at least they had a place to sleep, that at least they ate something, she said between sobs. But I knew, deep down I always knew I was helping something terrible, and I will carry this guilt until the day I die. Forgiving myself is impossible. Her testimony illustrated how systems of exploitation depend not only on active perpetrators, but also on passive witnesses who choose not to see, not to speak, not to act, whether out of fear, necessity, or the simple convenience of not getting involved. The prosecutor used this testimony to argue that Subeto's crime was possible because society created conditions for it. Structural social invisibility, extreme poverty rendering families vulnerable, and a justice system that treats poor children as less important. Raphael, as the lead investigator of the reopened case, presented evidence meticulously organized over months, detailed financial records, showing that Subeto profited between 15 and 20,000 reais monthly from the forced labor of children over 15 years. Photos of multiple victims documented by the NGO, including the fateful image of Miguel from 2003, maps detailing the different exploitation points scattered across the West Zone, testimonies from residents confirming the defendant's behavioral pattern, and finally, the irrefutable forensic report confirming that Miguel Santos had died in March 2005 from untreated bacterial pneumonia in a state of severe malnutrition while under the direct or indirect control of the defendant. The charge was clear and forceful: qualified kidnapping of multiple victims, continuous exploitation of child labor, formation of a criminal organization, and manslaughter by willful omission of aid regarding Miguel Santos. The public ministry requested the maximum sentence for all crimes, arguing that Subeto operated an exploitation network for a decade and a half, destroying the lives of dozens of children while hiding behind a mask of benevolence. Subeto's defense tried to argue, increasingly desperately, that he rescued children from the streets, that he offered opportunities they wouldn't have otherwise, that the boys were free to leave whenever they wanted, that he couldn't be held responsible for Miguel's death because the boy was theoretically free when he fell ill. The arguments rang hollow and even offensive in the face of the overwhelming volume of evidence and the palpable pain of the families present in the courtroom. Witness after witness destroyed this narrative, showing that the children were held through psychological coercion, threats, isolation, and a total absence of alternatives. After 3 weeks of trial, the jury deliberated for 8 hours before returning with a unanimous verdict, guilty on all charges. The judge, in a historic sentence that would be cited in law books and police training courses for years to follow, sentenced Roberto Silva Santos to 47 years in prison, initially in a closed regime, without the possibility of parole before serving at least 2/3 of the sentence. Upon pronouncing the sentence, the magistrate made a declaration that would echo far beyond that courtroom. This case is not just about an individual criminal who exploited vulnerable children for personal profit and convenience. This case is a mirror being placed before our society, forcing us to see something we prefer to ignore: how we treat our most vulnerable children. The defendant exploited boys and girls for 15 years, in plain sight of thousands of people, because our social structure allowed and even facilitated it. He operated at busy intersections, where hundreds of drivers saw children working daily, and no one questioned where they came from, why they were there, if anyone was looking for them. The exploitation of Miguel Santos and the other victims was possible because, collectively, we chose not to see, and when we do not see, we become accomplices. The room exploded in applause, tears, and hugs. Maria collapsed into José's arms, releasing 10 years of pain, anger, frustration, and finally, a fragment of closure. Fernanda hugged Raphael, thanking him for the persistence no one else had shown. Carlos, the former exploited boy who testified, cried silently, feeling that perhaps his own pain finally had some meaning, some purpose. For the Santos family, the conviction brought a complex feeling of partial and delayed justice. Subeto was in prison. There was official recognition of what happened to Miguel. The boy finally had a grave with his real name, where they could visit him and bring flowers. But none of this brought Miguel back. Nothing erased a decade of pain, of sleepless nights, of torturous unanswered questions. Nothing changed the fact that he died, alone, probably thinking his mother had abandoned him, when in truth she never stopped looking, not for a single day. "My son died thinking I didn't love him enough to find him," Maria said in an emotional interview after the trial, her voice choked but firm for the first time in years. "He never knew that I looked for him every second of those 10 years, that I sat on that bench every afternoon, waiting to see him come up the alley, that I never not for a moment, stopped being his mother. And that is something I will carry for the rest of my life, the certainty that my boy died feeling abandoned. But from the deepest pain was born a transformative purpose. In the months following the trial, the Santos family, supported by Rafael, human rights organizations, volunteer lawyers, and other families who had lost children in similar circumstances, created the Miguel Santos Institute, dedicated to 3 integrated missions: actively searching for missing children whose cases were neglected by the system, giving visibility and pressuring authorities on archived investigations of poor families, and working for the reform of structures that perpetuate the social invisibility of the most vulnerable children. Fernanda, utilizing that same determination and capacity for articulation she had shown at 15 pasting posters in hostile neighborhoods, became the executive coordinator of the institute. She developed search protocols, established partnerships with police stations in different states, created a database cross-referencing missing children's information with records of unidentified children in hospitals and shelters, and principally gave a face and voice to cases the system preferred to forget. In 5 years of operation, the Miguel Santos Institute directly contributed to the resolution of 17 child disappearance cases that had been archived. The teal-green bench, which for so many years was an altar of solitary pain, was restored through community mobilization and transformed into an official memorial. The City Hall installed a bronze plaque with an inscription that became the motto of a movement. Miguel Santos, 1994-2005, the boy society didn't see. May his story teach us to truly look. Around the bench, permanent flowers were planted, and the community adopted a tradition of keeping the space always clean, decorated, and respected. It became a meeting place for mothers and fathers of other missing children, a space of collective mourning, but also of resistance and hope. Rafael, deeply transformed by the experience of finally getting justice for Miguel after 10 years of carrying that case on his conscience, became a national reference in the investigation of child disappearances and crimes against vulnerable children. He developed and implemented new police protocols to ensure that cases involving poor children received exactly the same level of attention, resources, and urgency as cases from middle and upper-class families, an effort to combat unconscious biases deeply rooted in Brazilian police culture. He trained hundreds of police officers in different states on social invisibility, class and race biases in criminal investigation, and the need to question automatic assumptions that lead to premature archiving. He also worked with legislators, helping to formulate and approve important legal changes, the creation of departments specialized in crimes against vulnerable children in all Brazilian capitals, reformulation of initial search protocols to eliminate discriminatory presumptions, like automatically assuming a poor child ran away or got involved in crime, and the passing of a federal law making immediate and complete investigation of any child disappearance mandatory, regardless of the family's social class, with heavy fines for authorities violating the protocol. The Miguel Santos case also generated systemic changes beyond the police scope. Human rights NGOs used the story as a case study in national campaigns about social invisibility and inequality in access to justice. Universities incorporated the case into social work, psychology, law, and journalism. Courses analyzing how social structures perpetuate vulnerability and how professionals can act to break these patterns. Documentaries were produced, books were written, educational programs were developed, always keeping Miguel at the center, not as a statistic, but as a person, as a child who name a story, a family who loved him. 10 years after the trial in 2023, on the 21st anniversary of Miguel's disappearance, a special ceremony was held in the community. Hundreds of people attended, relatives of other missing children the Miguel Santos Institute had helped, activists who used the case as a symbol of a broader struggle, police officers who had been trained by Rafael and now investigated cases with a transformed gaze, local children who never met Miguel but learned his story in schools as part of a curriculum on citizenship and human rights. Maria, now elderly and Frail but still possessing that strength only mothers who have lost children develop, sat on the restored memorial bench and spoke to the gathered crowd, her voice amplified by microphones but charged with intimate emotion. My son existed. He had small dreams of a child. He wanted to play ball, wanted a new pair of sneakers, wanted to learn to read better. He had fears, laughter, tantrums, moments of joy, everything a child should have. For a long time, the world tried to pretend he didn't matter, that he was just another poor boy from the favela who disappeared and that no one should bother looking for. But Miguel mattered. To me, to his father, to his sister, and now to you too. Every child that disappears in this country matters. I won't bring my son back. Nothing will return the years I lost without knowing where he was, without being able to comfort him when he was scared, without being there when he needed me most. But I will ensure with every day I have left of life that no other family spends 10 years without answers, without justice, without someone truly caring. Miguel died invisible to the eyes of a society that chose not to see, but his legacy will ensure that never again is a child treated as if they didn't exist. The audience applauded, standing up, many weeping openly. Fernanda took the microphone after her mother and announced that the Miguel Santos Institute had secured funding to expand operations to 5 new states, and that a new state law would mandate all public schools in Rio to have annual campaigns about missing children, keeping awareness alive. Rafael announced that the police academy had permanently institutionalized training on biases and social invisibility, guaranteeing that future generations of investigators would not repeat the mistakes that cost Miguel his life. Miguel Santos's story thus became a painful but necessary symbol of Brazil's structural failures in protecting its most vulnerable. It is not a story with a happy ending. Miguel didn't come home, didn't grow up, didn't realize his small childhood dreams. But it is a story with meaning, with impact, with a legacy that transcends individual tragedy. The boy no one looked for properly in 2002, who spent 3 years invisible, working at busy signals while thousands passed without seeing, who died alone and nameless in 2005, became in death a catalytic force for change, a name that would not be forgotten, an amplified cry against indifference that kills as much as direct violence. The teal-green bench remains there to this day, flowers always fresh, maintained by the community as a living promise that Miguel Santos existed, mattered and continues to matter. And every time someone sits on that bench and really looks at the children passing by, really sees their faces, their stories, their humanity, Miguel's legacy grows a little more. If this story touched you, share it so more people know Miguel Santos's case. Support organizations that search for missing children, report situations of child exploitation you witness, and most importantly, truly look at the invisible children who still exist on every corner, at every traffic light, in every periphery of our country. Ask where they come from. Question why they are there. Do not accept child exploitation as a normal part of the urban landscape, because every child deserves to be seen, looked for, protected, and loved. Always. Miguel taught us this with his absence. Now it is up to us to honor this lesson with our presence, our attention, our shared humanity.